Preston. William Lowe and I are back to do another roadmap, and tonight we're going to talk about the importance of celebrating your wins. I know, William, you've got some thoughts on this, so why don't you explain to us a little bit about your thoughts on why it's important to celebrate your wins and how that might lead to a better recovery?
Yeah, sure thing. So I'm happy to kick this off. So I think when it comes to recovery after stroke, 90% of it is above your shoulders. And this is no pun intended. And the reason why I say this is because a lot of recovery after stroke comes down to mindset. And if you're going into stroke recovery with the mindset that you can recover or live in the hopes that things will get better over time, you're most likely going to be met with failure and a lot of disappointment. And the reason why I say this is because in recovery after stroke, the improvements often happen very quickly over long periods of time. And if you're observant in your recovery after stroke, what you can actually identify are opportunities the brain is actually giving you to actually turn small movements that you've gotten back or that your brain has recovered into permanent, tangible movements, which allow you to move towards a permanent state of recovery after stroke and get a lot closer to where you were before your stroke. So, quite often in recovery after stroke, a lot of stroke survivors are told that in the very early days of their recovery after stroke, that's when the most recovery happens, or in other words, the first 6 months. And this is very, and this is very true because at the very first 6 months of your stroke, that's when your brain is most plastic or most receptive to learning new things, learning new experiences, and adapting to new changes. In other words, it hasn't been exposed to a lot of the things or a lot of the exercises which it used to do before you had your stroke. So in other words, your after your stroke, your brain has pretty much been given a clean slate. It's forgotten a lot of things that it used to do, and
Hmm.
and it hasn't yet been reminded of how to do those things after your stroke. And so that's why the first 6 months, that's why a lot of stroke survivors find that their recovery is quite quick and they're able to see changes on a daily basis, if not on a week by week basis. But after this first 6 months, what a lot of stroke survivors find is that the changes that they see, it tends to slow down or they become harder to see because at this stage, what's basically happened is that your brain's been exposed to a lot of exercises and a lot of new experiences after your stroke, some of which have probably become a little bit too predictable to your brain. And because they become predictable to your brain, they don't really give your brain an incentive to actually want to pay attention and latch onto something to actually want to recover. And and this is very true in the case of people who haven't had a stroke, which is the reason why your brain or which is the reason why we tend to remember certain events in our lives, such as traumatic events like car accidents, such as milestones like when you had a first kiss or something like that. So I think in recovery after stroke, because recovery is such a long-term process, it's really important to really celebrate the small wins that you're getting along the way, because quite often these small wins can represent your brain telling you that it's actually learned something and it's actually regained a small little bit of movement. And if you pay attention to this small movement and you work on it, then you can turn that movement into a permanent movement into your life, which possibly would improve the quality of your life after stroke and also allow you to recover a lot more in your recovery after stroke. So so one big example of this is that you might notice that you just did an exercise and a week later, let's say that when you first started doing the exercise, your hand was curled up or balled up in a fist like this. So in other words, you couldn't open your fingers, and even if you wanted to open up your fingers would actually want to clench in and they would want to stay shut. So this is a very common example for a lot of stroke survivors. So let's say you do an exercise, and let's say that a week later, you might notice that your fingers are no longer clenched in or balled up like a fist, but rather the gap between your hand and your fingers is actually a lot more. And your fingers have actually come out a lot more. So that that improvement or that change for a lot of stroke survivors, they might not see that as a tangible improvement because they can't actually see any movement. But in fact, that's more change from being brought up in a fist to having a relaxed hand where there's a gap between your fingers and your palm. That's actually the beginning of a bigger improvement, which can allow you to actually open or relax your fingers completely. So I think, in recovery after stroke, rather than seeing something and not seeing a big movement straight away, rather than shrugging it off and thinking that, oh, it's not an improvement and the problem's not quote unquote fixed, that it's really important to really celebrate these wins or these small changes, any amount of change that you see in your recovery after stroke, because it can actually give you the opportunity to work on a movement and make it a lot bigger so that you can see some tangible changes in your life after stroke. So, having said that, I just want to pass it back to you, Ralph, because I know we've been chatting for a while since we've known each other, and you've shared a story about how you first discovered how you were able to turn the small movement of relaxing your fingers a little bit for the first time into an even bigger movement so that you can now open your hand. Do you want to maybe share a little bit about that to just highlight this idea of celebrating your wins?
Sure. Um, sure, I'll tell that in just a sec. Well, first of all, throughout my recovery, I, you know, I didn't think about these things in terms of concepts, but I guess because of this particular story, it made me aware of anytime I got any movement, I I recognized it and I tried to jump on it and take advantage of it, like you were talking about. That's one of the importance of paying attention and noticing even minor improvements, even even if you're still frustrated that you're not doing what you used to do before your stroke or not fully opening your hand or whatever. So this came about in the rehab hospital a couple days, or first day, a couple days into OT class, and my hand was, it wasn't in a claw, and my fingernails weren't digging in to my hand, but it was pretty much closed. And they told me to practice basically mental imagery, um, mental practice, the concept of believing that you can move and trying to move. It's a thing behind mirror box therapy. So they told me to stare at my fingers and imagine moving them and try and move them when I imagine moving them. So it's the way I tell the story goes. I say, I didn't say it out loud, but I thought, this is crazy. And I also said to myself, well, I don't have a better plan. In fact, I don't have a plan at all. So may as well try it. And so I did. And a couple days later, I felt stupid. I'm staring at my hand, thinking, "What is this going to do?" Well, a couple days later, I got just a little teeny flicker of movement. Showed them at in OT the next day, and they got all excited. And again, I'm thinking, like, you're getting all excited about this. But I made a connection. So they said, "Can you do it again?" And I went, "Yeah." And I went, "Oop," and just moved them a fraction of an inch. And can you do it again? And I went, "Yeah." And they went, "Great." I was thinking, what do you mean great? I want to open my hand. I want to put it back on cameras. I want to twist and focus and zoom the lenses and everything. This is like, anyway. So from that point on, I became aware. Well, not from that point, but from that point on, I took it and they told me I could build on it because I'd made a connection. And I had, because from that point on, I could reliably, on command, move my fingers. And, went from a eighth or a 16th of an inch to, in a week or so, like a half an inch. And in a couple of weeks, I was getting I wasn't opening it all the way, but I was getting, pretty good movement out of it. And it just kept building and building and building. So I learned that a couple of things from that. When you get any kind of improvement or flicker of movement, as you like to call them, jump on it. Jump on it. Take advantage of it. And I also learned to, because I'd had that experience, I also learned to pay attention and look for other improvements so that I could jump on them. So, um, so that's what I did. And it was definitely influenced by the folks in the OT class or OT therapy session that I thought were nuts at first. But mental imagery, mental practice works, and so does jumping on it, and so does building on any kind of connection that you make with your brain, or that your brain makes on its own. Sometimes you just get more movement, especially during that first 6 month period. And it's so important to do what you can do during that 6 month period. I see so many people. If I could change one thing about stroke, and I've said this a few times, it would be to make people aware of the fact that they need to take advantage of all that extra neuroplasticity they have the first 6 months or year when you're in that spontaneous healing period. Yeah, if you don't do anything, you'll heal some and then it'll stop. But if you jump all over everything during first 6 months or year, you're going to get a whole lot more back than if you sit around. You, like you said, William, a lot of it's above the shoulders. If you don't have a good attitude, you tend to sit around and waste some of that. So if I could change anything, it would be to give everybody a good attitude so they could jump right on their recovery right away and take more advantage of neuroplasticity. But I don't have a magic wand. So those are some initial thoughts on it. Well, what else you got, William?
Well, I mean, so I second what Ralph said there about jumping on it, jumping on the movement, because one of the things which my neurosurgeon told me a long time ago was this idea about the train of life and how it only stops every now and then. Well, when I think about recovery after stroke, every every now and then the train of recovery is only going to stop so often. And if you don't get on that train of recovery, or if you don't capitalize on a particular movement, then you don't know when the next train is going to come back. So I've known some stroke survivors who, at the start of their stroke recovery, they were able to open their hand, but because maybe they had a setback, or maybe they stopped working on it because they thought that once it's back, that it's back forever, that they lost the movement. So I think the idea in recovery after stroke and the idea of celebrating your wins is that once you get back any sort of movement, and I call these flickers of movement because it's a little half inch or it's a little 16th of an inch. I use the metric system here in Australia. That it's important to not see that movement as just not a movement because it hasn't fixed your recovery and you haven't gotten everything back straight away, but rather as a stepping stone to something which can become even greater, or a permanent movement that you can actually use in everyday life. And this doesn't just apply to the hand. I mean, the only case I would say that it doesn't apply to the hand is if you get your ability to grip back first. If you do get your ability to flex your fingers back first, I do not recommend that you bang out repetitions on a gripper or putty. But this also applies to walking as well. So some stroke survivors that I've helped, they've told me that a couple of weeks after that they might notice that they're walking with more of a rhythm, that their gait is a lot better, and it feels like they're not relying a lot more on their affected side to actually walk, and using their affected side as a crutch to actually use before they lift up their affected leg. So I think I think celebrating your wins is really important because your brain is basically giving you an opportunity, or a train to catch. And then if you catch that train and if you ride that wave of recovery as far as possible, then it can help you go really go places in your recovery after stroke and really push the limits of your recovery after stroke, especially in those first 6 months. Because let me tell you, the neuroplasticity and the changes you see in the first 6 months, further down the line, a year or 2 years after the stroke, that those that change doesn't come back unless you do something which is completely out of left field and completely different to your brain. That you will not see the same rate of recovery that you saw in the first 6 months at 3 or 4 years further down the line in your recovery after stroke, unless you do something completely different in your recovery after stroke. So if you're a stroke survivor and you're watching this roadmap for the first time, and if you've gotten a little bit of movement back in your recovery after stroke, I urge you to please jump on that movement, make it a lot bigger, work on it every single day until it becomes permanent and until you can apply it to real life. So here in this roadmap, Ralph and I, we're pretty much giving you a formula for success. And that formula is that when you get a movement after your stroke, practice it, make sure it's big enough. And once it's big enough and once you're confident you can do it on demand and whenever you want, apply it straight away to real life. And as you apply this straight away to real life, and as you're doing activities or doing things around the house or doing things that you used to, you might notice the movement is going to become a lot more stronger over time or a lot more refined over time. So, so that is really the key message. And I think that speaking with a lot of stroke survivors in their own journey, I've seen a lot of stroke survivors who haven't who haven't taken this to heart, who have just shrugged off small changes only to realize that they can't get back those things that the brain learned earlier. Or in other words, they had missed that train of recovery that had come and they were still waiting on that next train of recovery to come. And it wasn't coming because they were too late in their recovery after stroke. Their muscles that tightened up and now their hand was balled up in a fist. And it was almost impossible to get back that movement that they once had when their hand wasn't balled up in the fist before. So so I just wanted to highlight everything that Ralph said. It all really comes down to attitude. This isn't a game. Stroke recovery isn't a game where you can do something and then quickly fix or address your symptoms after stroke, but rather you're in it for the long haul. It's a marathon. And quite often changes, you might not see them straight away, but they might take a couple of weeks to actually come to the surface. It might take a couple of weeks or a couple of months of doing mental imagery, for example, for you to actually see a little small movement come back. Because that's your brain's process of healing, and that's the time that your brain needs to take in order to get those signals to 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 go to your muscles. So I think if you just stay persistent and you do a daily check-in or a weekly check-in with yourself, maybe take a 40,000-foot view and compare yourself to where you were a month ago to where you are now, then you can really see the progress that you've made. And once you see that progress, you can jump on that progress and you can make those changes or continue to make those changes a lot bigger until you're really able to make those small changes permanent and tangible in your recovery after stroke and hopefully apply them to real life as well.
Um, I have a couple things. I definitely jumped on it. I didn't use that term ever in my recovery because I wasn't thinking about talking to other people about recovery. I definitely started using it about 3 years ago when a friend of mine, Bob Anderson, who didn't have any insurance, he got home and started. I saw the very first videos that he posted. I encouraged him basically to jump on, and then we did a talk about. Well, and he had quite a good recovery because he did what I did. He didn't sit around and wonder what he was going to do, or he jumped on the neuroplasticity. But I also saw a post in one of the groups from that made me make up. I didn't make it up. I didn't make jump up on it, and I didn't make up work what works. But I try and put things in couple word uh, into something that people can remember and understand. So the post was that this guy, it was a male, I don't remember his name. He said, my hand's starting to open, but said, I read in the book that it starts with your shoulder and then your arm and your elbow and your wrist and then your hand. So he said, so I'll wait till my shoulder comes back. And I went, before he was going to work on his hand. And that's when I started saying, work what works. Because it's real important, like we've said several times now, if you get some kind of movement like that, and it was controlled movement, a repeatable controlled movement, that you don't ignore it. Of course, commented and said, no, don't ignore that. Well, the other thing is, guess what? My hand, because I jumped on my hand early, my hand came back before I was rolling my fingers at 4 months, and at 4 months I could barely get my arm like that. It took me over a year to get my shoulder all the way up. So it doesn't always go the way it says in the book, whether you have the book or not. There's people read online about, typically it does. Typically it goes from the grosser muscles. That's why people walk before they get their hand back. Most of the time people do get their shoulder back before they get their hand back, but you can't ignore what's going on with you. And I would definitely agree with and reiterate the fact that you should somehow take notes, mental note. I did it in my mind. I got pretty good body awareness, so I knew how far I was opening my hand, what my kick felt like on my walk, and but if you don't, you might write it down, journal. You might take pictures or videos. I'm a video guy who didn't take any video of me recovering. Don't quite have an explanation for that. Wish I did. And another thing I always say is, you were talking about the 40,000-foot view. It's hard to do that. You wake up every day, like when your hair is going gray, you wake up every day and you can't see the changes. That's why it's important to, a lot of times your friends and family or people you don't see every day will notice things. It's important for you to try and notice the changes that you're making for a number of reasons. And one we haven't talked about is another little catchphrase: success builds on success. So when you make these little successes, when you pay attention to these little flickers of movement and you jump on it and you build on it, that gives you some confidence that you can do it with other parts of your body. It also gives, it makes you feel like, okay, I'm getting somewhere. There's a point to this. One of the things that's difficult is if you don't have the best attitude and you're not making good progress, it's pretty easy to get frustrated and to think that, you're never going to get where you want. And that's a vicious downward spiral. So when you pay attention to what's going on with you, you can jump on it, you notice these improvements, you get some improvements, and you start the spiral going the other way up, which is the way you want it to go. Things don't tend to stay static in the world. You're either going up or going down, in my opinion. So anything else you got, William?
Well. I mean, I disagree with everything you said. I mean, especially with the sparring up and or sparring down. So I think in recovery after stroke, as a lot of the folks who are watching this roadmap have probably noticed, we've talked a lot about the mental aspect of recovery after stroke, and I think in recovery after stroke is that it's a game that you're either in or you're in the way. So whenever you get a recovery, whenever you get a movement back after stroke, one thing that you want to ask yourself is, are you in? Are you in or are you in the way? So are you in, meaning are you invested in getting this movement back, or are you in your own head and you're getting in the way of your own recovery? And for some stroke survivors, this might be the case. They might get something small back, and they might be discouraged that it's not something big, that they don't work on it. And because they don't work on it, they they get in their own head and they end up losing that movement. Or in other words, they end up losing that train of recovery which just stopped at the platform for them. So I think in recovery after stroke, I mean, as every stroke survivor has probably heard this little piece of advice, you've really got to use it or lose it. And I hate to use that phrase because it's so common, but I think it's
True.
especially relevant in this case because when you do get small wins, you don't wait for recovery to happen. Recovery is happening for you. So what that means is work what you can when you've got it, because if you don't work it and you focus on another aspect, you're likely going to lose it, especially in the case of your hand. So if your hand comes back first and you want to hit the shoulder first before you work on the hand, I would highly recommend that you work on the hand
Yep.
first and make sure that that's sorted out, or at least work on both. And it all comes back to this idea that I think of like to think of stroke recovery like, and it's this idea of spinning plates. So in recovery after stroke, you'll notice that you're going to be spinning a lot of plates in your recovery journey. So it might be your leg. So your leg recovery might be one plate, your hand recovery might be another plate, your shoulder recovery might be another plate, and then there are a lot of other plates. I mean, you obviously have the life plate, you've got the mental well-being plate, and you've got the work commitments plate.
Mm.
You've got all of these different plates to spin, and at any one time, when you don't focus on a particular plate too long, then you're going to drop that plate, and it's going to be hard to pick up that plate again. So if you really want to make the most out of your recovery, especially in those first 6 months, I highly recommend that you really focus all your efforts towards spinning all those plates at once to really ride that wave of recovery and ride that wave of neuroplastic change, which is the strongest in the first 6 months in your recovery after stroke.
Okay. Well, I like that one. Are you in or are you in the way? I might have to borrow that one. Um, and what I ended up telling the guy was, if you want to work on your shoulder, I worked on my hand. I did basically three types of therapy every day. I walked every other hour, and then I alternated between my hand and my arm, elbow and shoulder. And I kind of did my wrist. I didn't have too much spasticity in my wrist, luckily. But I did my wrist. I kind of considered wrist and hand and elbow and shoulder. So what I ended up telling him was work on both. If you think it ought to go like the book, work on both. Well, definitely don't ignore what you got going on with your hand, and that would be true of anything to anybody out there listening. You get something going, don't ignore it. Uh, jump on it, build on it, keep it going, and pay attention to how much improvement you're getting, because when you get improvement, that's highly motivating. And one of the things that's really difficult in this is to get motivated in the first place in recovery, and also to keep that momentum going. As William said, it's a marathon, not a sprint. That's another one that gets used a lot. So, it's just like running a long race, in the middle, you get discouraged and want to quit. So pay attention and celebrate those successes, because success builds on success, and they're highly motivating, and you can tend to keep going. It'll help with your mental attitude. So, um, William, unless you got something else, I think we say goodbye to the viewers. Um, Anything else you want
Oh
to add?
no, oh no, nothing else to add. 100% I would agree with what you just said. Wouldn't have anything else to add.
Okay. Well, for those of you who are tuned in for the first time, we do these on a regular basis. There are about 60 of them, and they're probably in well, they're in a playlist called Roadmap, and you're free to go back, and they all have titles about what we're talking about. So you're free to go back and find subjects that you might be interested in, and listen to others. And we appreciate you taking the time to listen to us tonight, and come back when you can. And William, thank you for your time.
Thank you, Ralph. It's a pleasure.